The champagne cork hit the ceiling of the private suite at the Ritz before Richard Sterling even signed the final papers. He was laughing, drunk on victory, and 50-year-old Scotch, bragging to anyone who would listen that he had just pulled off the heist of the century, divorcing his wife of 10 years and leaving her with absolutely nothing. No alimony, no house, not a single cent of his empire. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought the game was over. But he forgot the one rule of high-stakes warfare. Never underestimate your enemy's bloodline. He was celebrating taking everything, until the judge looked over his spectacles, paused the proceedings, and asked the one question that would shatter Richard's world. "Mr. Sterling, do you know who your wife's father is?" The air inside the VIP lounge of the Obsidian Room in Manhattan smelled of expensive leather, Cuban tobacco, and arrogance. It was a Tuesday night, barely 10 p.m., but Richard Sterling was already 3 sheets to the wind, holding court in a semicircle of sycophants and junior associates. Richard was 45, handsome in a jagged, predatory way, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars. He was the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a logistics conglomerate that had effectively monopolized shipping on the East Coast. He was a man who moved mountains, fired people before his morning coffee, and, as of tomorrow morning, would be a free man. "To the prenup!" Richard roared, raising a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25. "To the prenup!" echoed the chorus of men around him. Next to him sat Bradley Pearson, his lead counsel. Bradley was a man who looked like he had been born in a courtroom, slicked back hair, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a reputation for destroying opposing counsel so thoroughly they often left the profession. "You really outdid yourself, Brad," Richard said, clapping the lawyer on the shoulder. "I mean, honestly, she gets nothing? Not even the Hamptons' house?" Bradley took a measured sip of his drink. "Richard, the document she signed 10 years ago was a work of art. It wasn't just ironclad, it was a titanium vault. Clause 4, Section B specifically stated that any assets acquired during the marriage through the direct intellectual or physical labor of the primary earner remain sole property. Since she's been decorating and hosting charity galas for a decade, she doesn't have a leg to stand on. We offered her a settlement of $50,000 as a goodwill gesture. She's lucky to get that." Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. 50 grand. That won't even cover her shoe habit. God, I can't wait to see the look on her face tomorrow. She's been so quiet lately, just walking around the penthouse like a ghost. I think she finally realized she's been outplayed. She was always a bit simple, wasn't she? Asked one of the junior associates, a young man named Greg who was desperate to impress. Richard swirled his ice. "Catherine? Simple isn't the word. She's decorative. That's why I married her. I needed a wife who looked good on a magazine cover and didn't ask questions about where the money came from or who I was having dinner with. She was a florist, for God's sake. A florist. I plucked her out of a little shop in Greenwich Village. I gave her a life queens would envy. And how does she repay me? By getting bored, by complaining I'm never home, by asking for partnership." He sneered the word. "So I'm trading her in." He pulled out his phone and flashed a picture of a 23-year-old Instagram model named Tiffany. "Upgrade impending." "What about her lawyer?" Greg asked. "Who is representing her? Did she hire high profile?" Bradley Pearson scoffed. "Please, she hired some ancient solo practitioner from upstate, a guy named Elias Finch. I looked him up. The man is 78 years old. His office is above a bakery in Poughkeepsie. He specializes in estate planning and minor property disputes. He hasn't stepped foot in a Manhattan divorce court in 30 years. I almost feel bad for him. Almost. Richard leaned back, stretching his legs. She's desperate. She probably couldn't afford a real shark because I froze the joint accounts last week. She's going into the slaughterhouse with a butter knife, gentlemen. The mood was electric with the cruelty of men who felt untouchable. Richard thought back to the morning he had served her the papers. Catherine had been arranging lilies in the foyer. She hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She had just looked at the papers, then up at him with those wide, unreadable hazel eyes. "Are you sure this is how you want to do this, Richard?" she had asked. Her voice had been soft, almost gentle. "I'm taking it all, Kate," he had replied. "You're going back to the flower shop." She had nodded slowly, placed the flowers in the vase, and walked away. That silence had bothered him for a moment, but he had quickly dismissed it as shock. She was a mouse, a beautiful, elegant mouse, but a mouse nonetheless. And he was the cat who had just locked the door. "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Richard announced, draining his glass. "We walk into the Southern District, Judge Harrison presiding. We present the prenup. The judge stamps it. I walk out a single billionaire. Dinner is on me tomorrow night, boys. We're going to Le Bernardin." He didn't know it then, as the music thumped and the alcohol flowed. But the mouse he was so eager to crush had spent the last 10 years doing something Richard never did. She had been listening, and she had been waiting. The morning of the hearing, New York City was blanketed in a cold, grey drizzle. It was fitting weather for a funeral, which was exactly what Richard expected this hearing to be for Catherine's lifestyle. Richard arrived at the courthouse in his black Maybach. He stepped out, flanked by Bradley Pearson and 2 paralegals carrying boxes of financial documents that they wouldn't even need to open. Richard wore a navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that cost $600. He looked every inch the titan of industry. Paparazzi were waiting. Richard had tipped them off himself. He wanted the world to see his victory. He flashed a dazzling smile, waved and ignored the questions shouted his way. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you're leaving your wife penniless?" "Richard, who is the new woman?" He breezed past security and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was quiet. Richard checked his Rolex. 8:55 a.m. "She's late," Richard muttered, probably terrified to show her face. "She'll be here," Bradley said, checking his notes. "If she doesn't show, we win by default. Either way, we win." Just then, the elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and Catherine Sterling stepped out. Richard blinked. He had expected her to look haggard, red-eyed, perhaps wearing something frumpy or overly modest to garner sympathy. Instead, Catherine looked expensive. She was wearing a cream-colored pencil skirt suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life. It was simple, but the cut screamed haute couture. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. She wore no jewelry except for a pair of small pearl earrings, but it was the man walking beside her who drew Richard's attention. He was old, yes. Elias Finch looked like a stiff wind might blow him over. He wore a tweed suit that looked like it smelled of mothballs, and he carried a battered leather briefcase that had seen better days in the Nixon administration. He walked with a slight limp, relying on a cane with a silver handle. Richard snorted. "Look at that," he whispered to Bradley. "Grandpa brought his walking stick. This is going to be a massacre." Catherine didn't look at Richard. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She walked past him with a serene, cool expression, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. She held the door open for her elderly lawyer, and they entered the courtroom. "Showtime," Richard said, buttoning his jacket. Inside, the courtroom was stark and imposing. The wood paneling was dark, the lighting fluorescent. Richard took his seat at the plaintiff's table, spreading his arms wide. Catherine and Mr. Finch sat at the defendant's table. Mr. Finch began slowly unpacking his briefcase, retrieving a single, thin manila folder and a thermos. "A thermos," Bradley whispered, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. All rise," the bailiff boomed. "The Honourable Judge Arthur Pendleton presiding." Richard sat up straighter. Judge Pendleton was known as a by-the-book judge. He was a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a permanent scowl. He didn't like drama, and he didn't like time-wasters. Perfect for enforcing a contract. Judge Pendleton took the bench, rustling his robes. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the docket. "Sterling versus Sterling," the judge read. "Petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets." He looked up. "I trust both parties are present?" "Richard Sterling, present, Your Honour," Bradley Pearson said, standing up smoothly. "Represented by Bradley Pearson of Pearson, Spector, and Associates." Mr. Finch stood up slowly, his knees popping audibly in the quiet room. "Catherine Sterling, present, Your Honour. Represented by Elias Finch." The judge peered at Mr. Finch. "Mr. Finch, I haven't seen you in this district in quite some time." "I've been semi-retired, Your Honour," Finch said, his voice raspy but surprisingly clear. "Enjoying the quiet life, but for Mrs. Sterling, I made an exception." "Very well," the judge said. "Let's proceed. Mr. Pearson, you filed the motion for summary judgment based on a prenuptial agreement?" "Yes, Your Honour," Bradley said, stepping into the aisle. He was in his element. "The facts of this case are simple. 10 years ago, prior to their marriage, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling signed a comprehensive prenuptial agreement. Both parties had independent counsel. The agreement clearly stipulates a separation of assets. Mr. Sterling's business interests, real estate holdings, and liquid capital are his sole property. We are asking the court to enforce the document as written and grant the divorce decree immediately." Bradley walked to the bench and handed a thick document to the clerk. "Exhibit A, Your Honour, the signed agreement." Judge Pendleton took the document and began to leaf through it. The silence in the room was heavy. Richard tapped his fingers on the table, watching Catherine. She was staring straight ahead, her posture perfect, her face a mask. "Why aren't you crying?" Richard thought, annoyed. "You should be begging." "Mr. Finch," the judge said, not looking up from the papers. "Do you contest the validity of this prenuptial agreement?" Mr. Finch stood up again. He didn't move to the aisle. He stayed behind his table, leaning on his cane. "We do not contest that the signature belongs to my client, Your Honour," Finch said. Richard smirked. It was over. "However," Finch continued, "we contest the enforceability of the agreement based on the doctrine of unconscionability and significant non-disclosure of material facts at the time of signing." Bradley Pearson laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Objection, Your Honour. This is a standard stall tactic. The agreement was drafted by top-tier firms. Unconscionability is a desperate reach." "Mr. Pearson," the judge snapped. "Let him finish." Finch smiled, a slow, dry expression. "Furthermore, Your Honour, there is a specific clause in the prenup, Clause 19, Paragraph 3, the integrity of lineage clause." Richard frowned. He leaned toward Bradley. "What is that?" "I don't remember an integrity clause." Bradley was flipping through his copy of the prenup frantically. I think it's boilerplate. Something about heirs. It doesn't matter. You don't have children." "Clause 19, Finch said, his voice gaining strength, states that the prenuptial agreement is rendered null and void if one party can prove that the marriage was entered into under false pretenses regarding the social or financial standing of the other party's immediate family, thereby causing reputational damage. Judge Pendleton stopped reading. He looked up. "Mr. Finch, are you suggesting Mr. Sterling lied about his family?" "No, Your Honor," Finch said softly. "I'm suggesting Mr. Sterling failed to ask the right questions about Mrs. Sterling's family, and in doing so, he triggered the clause himself by attempting to defraud a family of significant standing." Richard stood up, losing his cool. "This is ridiculous. Her father was a nobody. He ran a hardware store in Ohio. She told me that herself." The courtroom went deadly silent. Catherine slowly turned her head to look at Richard. For the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of the cat, finally revealing itself to the mouse. Judge Pendleton looked at Richard, then at Catherine. He took off his glasses. He looked at the paperwork again, specifically at Catherine's birth certificate, which was attached to the back of Mr. Finch's filing. The judge's face went pale. He looked up at Catherine with a sudden, dawning recognition and fear. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly. "You said her father ran a hardware store?" "Yes, she's a nobody," Richard shouted. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Sterling, you are a very wealthy man, but you are evidently a very poorly informed one. I am looking at the birth certificate of your wife. It seems you never bothered to check the legal name of her father." "What does it matter?" Richard demanded. "It matters," the judge said, "because if this name is accurate, this court has a very serious conflict of interest." The judge swallowed hard. "Mr. Sterling, do you know who your wife's father is?" Richard froze. The air left the room. "Who?" Richard whispered. "Her maiden name isn't just Blackwood," the judge said. "It's Blackwood Thorne." Mr. Finch opened his thermos and poured a cup of tea. "I believe, Your Honor," the old lawyer said, "that the witness list for today includes only one name. My client's father. He is waiting in the hallway. Shall I call him in?" The silence in courtroom 4B stretched, thin and taut, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. It wasn't the empty silence of a pause. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb that had landed but hadn't yet detonated. Richard Sterling blinked, the judge's question bouncing around his skull without finding a place to land. "Who is your wife's father?" "I told you," Richard said, though his voice lacked its usual boom. It sounded tinny in the large room. "He's a nobody, some retiree in Ohio. I met him once at the wedding. He wore a rented tuxedo." Bradley Pearson, however, was not speaking. The high-priced lawyer had gone very still. He was staring at the name on the birth certificate the judge was holding, upside down from his vantage point, but legible enough. His complexion, usually a confident, sunbed bronze, had turned the color of wet ash. "Richard," Bradley whispered, barely moving his lips. "Shut up." "Excuse me?" Richard snapped, turning to his lawyer. "Don't tell me to—" "I said shut up!" Bradley hissed, a line of sweat instantly appearing on his upper lip. "If that name is Blackwood Thorne, we are not in a divorce hearing anymore. We are in a kill box." Richard looked at his lawyer, confused by the genuine terror in the man's eyes. Before he could demand an explanation, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom groaned. They didn't fly open. They didn't slam. They opened slowly, deliberately, with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a beast exhaling. A single figure stood in the doorway. He was a man who made the very concept of age seem irrelevant. He was perhaps 75, maybe 80, but he stood with the upright, rigid posture of a military commander. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that made Richard's Brioni look like a costume. It was cut from wool so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. He wore no watch. He carried no phone. He didn't need to check the time. Time waited for him. He leaned slightly on a cane made of black ebony, topped with a handle of unpolished silver, carved in the shape of a hawk's head. He stepped into the room. Thud. Step. Thud. Step. The sound of the cane hitting the floor was the only noise in the world. As he walked down the center aisle, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew colder. The bailiff, a burly man who had looked bored 5 minutes ago, instinctively straightened his spine and tucked in his shirt. Judge Pendleton stood up. He didn't just look attentive, he looked like a schoolboy caught passing notes. Mr. Thorne, the judge stammered. I wasn't aware you would be attending in person. We could have arranged a private chamber. The old man stopped at the railing. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Catherine. He turned his head slowly, his eyes, pale, icy blue, the exact same shade as Catherine's, locking on to Richard. It was a look of such profound, dissecting indifference that Richard felt a chill crawl down his spine. It wasn't hatred. Hatred implies you care about the object of your hate. This was the way a boot looks at an ant. I prefer the open court, Arthur, the man said. His voice was like grinding stones, deep, resonant, and impossibly calm. He called the judge by his first name. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, is it not? Yes. Yes, of course, sir, Judge Pendleton said, sitting back down hurriedly. Richard's ego, bruised but not dead, flared up. He couldn't handle being ignored. He stood up, smoothing his tie. Look, I don't know who you think you are, Richard said, projecting his boardroom voice. But this is a closed session for a divorce proceeding. You can't just waltz in here and intimidate the bench. Who is this guy, Kate? Your uncle. The old man didn't blink. He moved to the defendant's table and placed a hand on Catherine's shoulder. She didn't look up, but Richard saw her hand reach up and cover her father's, squeezing it tight. It was a gesture of intimacy and alliance that Richard realized with a jolt she had never shown him. Mr. Finch, the elderly lawyer from Poughkeepsie, smiled. Mr. Sterling, allow me to formally introduce you to my client's father. This is Silas Blackwood Thorne. You may know him better as the majority shareholder of the Atlantic Sovereign Bank, the chairman of the Thorne Steel Consortium, and, well, the man who effectively owns the shipping lanes your logistics company uses every single day. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Thorne Steel. Richard's company, Sterling Dynamics, moved freight. They moved steel, heavy machinery, and automotive parts. 80% of his contracts were with subsidiaries of Thorne Industries. If this man was that Thorne... That's impossible, Richard muttered, his voice trembling. Kate said her father ran a hardware store. She said she was from Ohio. Silas Thorne finally spoke to Richard. He moved around the table, taking a seat that Mr. Finch pulled out for him. He sat with the grace of a king taking a throne. I do own a hardware store, Mr. Sterling, Silas said. It was my grandfather's first business. I keep it open for sentimental reasons. I enjoy spending my Saturdays there. It keeps me grounded, a quality you seem to have entirely missed. Silas gestured to the judge with a flick of his hand. Proceed, Arthur. My daughter has listened to this man speak for 10 years. I believe it is her turn. Judge Pendleton looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, on Earth. Perhaps a war zone or a volcano, rather than in the crossfire between Richard Sterling and Silas Thorne. Right, the judge said, clearing his throat nervously. Mr. Finch, you were explaining the integrity of lineage clause. Yes, Your Honor, Finch said. The old country lawyer was suddenly looking much sharper. The bumbling grandpa act was dropping away. As I stated, the prenuptial agreement Richard Sterling so arrogantly waved around this morning contains a clause designed to protect the assets of the wealthier party from a spouse who enters the marriage under false pretenses. I am the wealthier party, Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I built Sterling Dynamics from the ground up. When I met her, she was arranging tulips for minimum wage. Were you? Finch asked softly. Or were you merely the beneficiary of a test you didn't know you were taking? Finch opened the second file on his desk. Mr. Sterling, Finch continued, let's go back 10 years. You were a mid-level manager at a trucking firm. You had ambition, certainly, but you had no capital, no connections. Then you met Catherine. 3 months after you started dating Catherine, you suddenly secured a loan for $2 million from a private equity firm called Obsidian Ventures. You used that to start your company. Is that correct? Richard narrowed his eyes. That was my business acumen. I pitched them. They liked my vision. Obsidian Ventures, Finch read from a document, is a shell company wholly owned by the Blackwood Thorne family trust. Richard froze. And then, Finch went on, relishing the slow pace, your first big contract, the breakthrough. You secured the exclusive shipping rights for Northeast Auto Parts, a contract worth $10 million a year. You told everyone it was your charm that won that deal. It was, Richard insisted, though sweat was now trickling down his temple. I took the CEO to dinner. We bonded. Silas Thorne let out a low, dry chuckle. It was a terrifying sound. You took a mid-level vice president to dinner, Mr. Sterling, Silas said calmly. I own Northeast Auto Parts. I ordered that contract be given to you. I wanted to see what you would do with a leg up. I wanted to see if you would build something of value for my daughter, or if the money would simply amplify your worst qualities. Silas leaned forward, his hands resting on the silver hawk head of his cane. You see, Richard, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that carried to the back of the room. Catherine didn't want my money. She wanted a life of her own. She wanted to find a man who loved her for her, not for the Thorne name. So we made a deal. She would live simply. She would work in a flower shop. She would find a partner. And if that partner proved to be a good man, I would quietly ensure his success, so she would never want for anything. Catherine finally looked at Richard. Her eyes were dry, but filled with a profound disappointment. I tried to tell you, Richard, she said softly. Remember our 3rd anniversary, when you landed the government contract? I asked you to thank God, or luck, or just be humble. And you told me it was because you were a king, and I was just lucky to be in your orbit. Richard stammered. He looked at Bradley. Do something. This is hearsay. They can't prove they rigged my business. Bradley Pearson had his face buried in his hands. He looked up, his eyes hollow. Richard, look at the prenup. Clause 19. Richard grabbed the document, his hands shaking so hard the paper rattled. Clause 19. In the event that the party of the first part, the husband, claims sole ownership of assets derived from capital provided by the immediate family of the party of the second part, the wife, and fails to acknowledge said contribution, the party of the first part agrees that all such assets shall be considered fruit of the poisoned tree and revert immediately to the original grantor. Richard read it 3 times. The legalese was dense, but the meaning was clear. You signed it, Richard, Bradley whispered. defeated. "We thought it was boilerplate protection for you, in case her family gave us a loan. We never thought she was the whale." "I didn't know," Richard screamed, looking at the judge. "This is entrapment. They hid who they were." "We respected your privacy," Silas countered coolly. "We allowed you to believe you were a self-made man. We gave you the rope, Mr. Sterling. We waited 10 years to see if you would climb with it or hang yourself." Silas gestured around the courtroom. "You cheated on her." Silas listed the offenses on his fingers. "Not once, but repeatedly. You belittled her intelligence in public. You isolated her from her friends. And finally, you tried to cast her out on the street with $50,000. Silas stood up slowly. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, red leather notebook. He tossed it onto the table in front of Richard. "The red ledger," Silas said. Richard looked at the book. "What is this?" "That," Silas said, "is a record of every single dollar I have funneled into Sterling Dynamics over the last decade. Every lucky break you had, every miracle loan, every surprise tax rebate. It totals roughly $350 million. Silas smiled, and it was the smile of a predator closing its jaws. "According to the contract you were so eager to enforce this morning. You don't own Sterling Dynamics, Richard. You don't even own the suit you're wearing. Technically, since you paid for it with the company credit card." "I do." Richard felt the room spinning. He gripped the edge of the table. "You can't take my company. It's mine. My name is on the building." "It's on the building," Finch interjected cheerfully. "But the building is on land, owned by a holding company called Rosewood Properties. Guess who owns Rosewood?" Catherine stood up. She walked over to the plaintiff's table. She looked down at Richard, who was now slumped in his chair, a broken man in a $600 tie. She reached out and picked up the red notebook Silas had thrown. "I didn't want it to end like this, Richard," she said, her voice steady. "I really didn't. I loved you. For the first 3 years, I really loved you. I thought the money was changing you, but I hoped you'd come back." She leaned in close. "But then you served me papers on our anniversary," she whispered, "and you laughed while you did it." She straightened up and turned to the judge. "Your Honor," Catherine said, her voice ringing clear. "My lawyer has a counter motion to file. We aren't asking for half." Richard looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Maybe she would be merciful. "We are petitioning for full enforcement of Clause 19, Catherine said, shattering that hope. "I want the company, I want the accounts, I want the penthouse, and I want him to pay the legal fees for the time we've wasted here today." Judge Pendleton looked at Richard, then at the terrifying figure of Silas Thorne, and finally at Catherine. "Mr. Pearson," the judge said to Richard's lawyer, "I suggest you ask for a recess. You have about 5 minutes to decide if you want to surrender or if you want me to let Mr. Finch formally enter that red ledger into evidence. Because if that ledger enters the public record, your client won't just be broke. He'll be under investigation for securities fraud, for claiming assets he didn't own." Richard looked at Bradley. Bradley didn't look back. He was already packing his briefcase. "Recess?" Richard croaked. "We need a recess." Silas Thorne checked an imaginary watch on his wrist. "You have 10 minutes, Mr. Sterling. I have a lunch reservation at the club, and I hate to be late." As Richard stumbled out of the courtroom toward the consultation chambers, his legs feeling like jelly, he realized the horror of his situation. He hadn't just lost the divorce. He had walked into a trap that had been set 10 years ago, and he had just sprung it on himself. But as he entered the small private room with Bradley, the lawyer slammed the door and turned on him with a look of frantic desperation. It's worse than you think, Richard, Bradley said, his voice shaking. Worse? I'm losing the company. How can it be worse? Because, Bradley said, pulling out his phone and showing Richard a news alert that had just broken. While we were in here arguing, the SEC just announced a surprise audit of Sterling Dynamics, based on an anonymous tip about inflated assets. Bradley looked at the door where Silas Thorne was waiting. He didn't just come for the money, Richard, Bradley whispered. He's going for your freedom. The consultation room was a small, windowless box with beige walls and a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying insect. It was designed to be a place for strategy, a place where lawyers and clients whispered about plea deals and settlements, but for Richard Sterling, it felt like a coffin. He paced the small room, 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. His hands were slick with sweat, leaving damp marks on the mahogany table every time he leaned on it to catch his breath. This can't be happening, Richard muttered, his voice cracking. It's a bluff. It has to be a bluff. The Red Ledger? Who keeps a physical notebook in the 21st century? It's hearsay. It's inadmissible. Bradley Pearson was sitting in the corner, staring at his tablet. The shark of Manhattan divorce law looked like he had just swallowed a hook. He wasn't looking at Richard. He was scrolling through emails, his thumbs moving in a blur. "Bradley!" Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Stop playing with your phone and think! How do we kill the ledger?" Bradley stopped typing. He looked up slowly. His eyes were cold, devoid of the camaraderie they had shared over scotch just 12 hours ago. "We don't kill the ledger, Richard," Bradley said, his voice flat. "The ledger is the least of your problems. I just got off the phone with my partner at the firm. And the SEC didn't just receive an anonymous tip," Bradley said, turning the tablet screen toward Richard. "They received a dossier, detailed emails, wire transfer receipts, manifests showing that you were shipping phantom cargo to inflate your quarterly revenue numbers." Richard went pale. "Everyone does that. It's creative accounting." "It's fraud," Bradley corrected him sharply. "And here is the kicker. The timestamps on the leaked documents, they go back 5 years. Silas Thorne has been sitting on this evidence for 5 years. Richard slumped into a chair. The room seemed to tilt. Why? Why wait? "Because he was giving you a chance to stop," Bradley said, a realization dawning on him. "Don't you get it? He was watching you. If you had treated Catherine well, if you had been a faithful husband, maybe he would have let you keep the company, or at least let you retire quietly. But you got greedy. You wanted to humiliate her. You wanted to leave her with nothing." Bradley stood up and began buttoning his jacket. He picked up his briefcase. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, panic rising in his chest. "We have to go back in there. We need a counteroffer." "I am going back in there," Bradley said, "to ask the judge for permission to withdraw as your counsel." Richard leapt to his feet. "You can't do that. You're on a retainer." "My retainer covers divorce proceedings," Bradley snapped. "It does not cover a criminal conspiracy to defraud investors. And frankly, Richard, looking at the Clause 19 violation, you signed a document stating you disclosed all financials. If the SEC proves you were cooking the books, you committed perjury when you signed your financial affidavits this morning. I can't represent a client who lies to the court. It puts my license at risk." "You coward," Richard hissed. "I made you rich." "Silas Thorne is richer," Bradley said, his hand on the doorknob. "And unlike you, he plays the long game. I checked the roster of the Bar Association Ethics Committee. Do you know who the chairman is? A man named Marcus Thorne. Silas's brother. If I stay attached to you, I'll be disbarred by Christmas." Bradley opened the door. The sounds of the courthouse hallway drifted in, muffled footsteps, distant voices. "I suggest you go back in there and sign whatever they put in front of you," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because right now, Catherine is the only person in that room who might have a shred of mercy for you. Silas wants your head on a spike. She might just settle for your scalp." Bradley walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Richard stood alone in the buzzing room. The silence was deafening. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window of the door. The man staring back wasn't the titan of logistics. He looked small. He looked terrified. He thought about running. He could take the elevator down, slip out the back, get in his car, and go where? His credit cards were likely frozen. His passport was in the safe at the penthouse that Catherine now effectively owned. He was trapped. Slowly Richard straightened his tie. It was a reflex, a muscle memory of a man who used to have power. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "I am Richard Sterling," he whispered to himself, trying to summon the arrogance that had fueled him for 40 years. "I can talk my way out of this. I always do." But as he walked back toward courtroom 4B, his legs felt like lead. The long hallway felt like the Green Mile. He wasn't walking to a negotiation. He was walking to his execution. When Richard re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. The air was no longer heavy with tension. It was heavy with finality. Silas Thorne was no longer sitting. He was standing by the window, looking out at the grey Manhattan skyline, his back to the room. He looked like a general surveying a conquered city. Catherine sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her face serene but pale. Mr. Finch was pouring another cup of tea from his thermos. Judge Pendleton watched Richard walk to the plaintiff's table. He noted the absence of the high-priced lawyer. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, peering over his spectacles. "I see Mr. Pearson has departed." "He had a conflict of interest, Your Honor," Richard said, his voice hoarse. He gripped the edge of the table to stop his hands from shaking. "I will be representing myself for the remainder of this hearing." "A bold choice," the judge noted dryly, "though given the circumstances, perhaps an economical one. Have you reached a decision regarding the defendant's counter-motion?" Richard took a deep breath. He looked at Catherine. He needed to make eye contact. He needed to find that soft spot in her heart, the one he had exploited 1,000 times before. "Kate," he said, ignoring the judge. "Catherine, please." Catherine didn't turn. She stared straight ahead at the empty jury box. "We were married for 10 years, Richard pleaded, his voice taking on a desperate, wheedling tone. "We had good times. Remember Paris? Remember the house in the Hamptons when we first bought it? You can't just let your father destroy me. I built that company. Maybe he gave the money, fine. But I put in the hours. I made the deals. Doesn't that count for anything?" Silas Thorne turned around from the window. "You made deals with my leverage, Richard. A monkey could trade bananas if he owned the whole plantation." "I am speaking to my wife," Richard snapped, a flash of his old anger surfacing. "Then speak to her," Silas said, gesturing to Catherine. "But do not expect the woman you walked in here with. That woman is gone." Catherine slowly turned her head. For the first time all day, her expression wasn't blank. It was filled with a pity so deep it felt like a slap in the face. "You're right, Richard," she said softly. "You did put in the hours. You were always working. Or at least, that's what you told me." She reached into her handbag, a modest leather tote, and pulled out a stack of photographs. She slid them across the table. They fanned out across the dark wood. They weren't financial documents. They were photos of Richard. Richard at a restaurant with a blonde. Richard on a yacht with a brunette. Richard entering a hotel in Miami with the very Instagram model he had bragged about the night before. "I knew," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "I knew about Tiffany. I knew about the others. I knew about the offshore accounts you thought were hidden." Richard stared at the photos. "If you knew, why did you stay?" "Because I kept hoping," Catherine said, tears finally welling in her eyes. "I kept hoping that the man I met in the flower shop was still in there somewhere. The man who bought me a coffee and listened to me talk about hydrangeas for an hour. I thought the money had just sickened you. I thought if I loved you enough, I could cure you." She wiped a tear away with a gloved hand. "But yesterday," she continued, her voice hardening, "when you handed me those divorce papers, you were smiling. You looked so happy to hurt me. And that's when I realized, you aren't sick, Richard. You're just cruel." She looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, I accept the enforcement of Clause 19. I want the dissolution of the marriage immediately. And I want the assets transferred as per the contract." Judge Pendleton nodded solemnly. "Mr. Sterling, do you have any legal basis to contest the evidence provided by Mr. Finch regarding the source of your capital?" Richard looked at the red ledger sitting on the defense table. He looked at the photos of his affairs. He looked at the empty chair where his lawyer used to be. "No," Richard whispered. "Speak up, Mr. Sterling," the judge commanded. "No!" Richard shouted, his voice breaking. "No, I don't." "Very well." Judge Pendleton banged his gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. "Judgment is granted in favor of the defendant, Catherine Blackwood Thorne. Per the prenuptial agreement, specifically Clause 19, the court finds that all assets held by Sterling Dynamics, as well as all personal real estate and liquid holdings acquired during the marriage, are the fruit of the poisoned tree. Ownership reverts to the originating trust." The judge signed a paper with a flourish. "Effective immediately, Mr. Sterling, you are ordered to vacate the premises of Sterling Dynamics and the penthouse apartment at 432 Park Avenue. You have 24 hours to remove personal effects. Personal effects are defined strictly as clothing and toiletries. No electronics, no jewelry, no art." Silas Thorne stepped forward. He walked to the center of the room, standing directly in front of Richard. The old man towered over him, despite the cane. "There is one more thing," Silas said. The judge paused. "Mr. Thorne?" "The name," Silas said. "The company is called Sterling Dynamics. It bears his name. My daughter's trust paid for the trucks, the warehouses, and the fuel. I will not have my family's capital associated with his name any longer." Silas looked at Richard. "As part of the settlement," Silas said, "you will sign a public statement admitting that your success was not self-made. You will admit that you were a steward of Thorne Capital, and you will resign as CEO, appointing Catherine as the interim chairwoman." I can't do that," Richard stammered. "My reputation, it's all I have left." "You have no reputation," Silas said coldly. "The SEC press release went out 10 minutes ago. Your stock has dropped 40% since we returned from recess. By tomorrow morning, Sterling will be synonymous with fraud. If you sign the statement, I will ask the board not to pursue civil damages against you personally for the mismanagement of funds. If you don't sign, I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never even manage a shift at a fast food restaurant." Richard looked at the pen Silas held out. It was a cheap, plastic Bic pen, a deliberate insult compared to the Mont Blanc Richard usually used. Richard's hand shook as he took it. He felt the eyes of the room on him. The bailiff, the court reporter, the clerk, they were all watching the king of logistics crumble into dust. He bent over the paper. Mr. Finch slid in front of him. "I, Richard Sterling, acknowledge." He signed. The signature was jagged, weak. "Done," Richard whispered. "Are you happy?" Silas snatched the paper away. "Happiness has nothing to do with it. This is pest control." Catherine stood up. She gathered her purse. She didn't look at Richard. She walked to her father and took his arm. "Let's go, Dad," she said. "I have a board meeting to prepare for." "Kate!" Richard called out as they turned to leave. He sounded like a child lost in a supermarket. "What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go?" Catherine stopped near the heavy oak doors. She turned one last time. She looked at his bespoke suit, his Italian shoes, his perfect haircut. "You said I was simple, Richard," she said. "You said I was just a florist. Maybe you should try it. It's honest work, and they're hiring down on 4th Street. She pushed the doors open. Light from the hallway flooded in, blinding Richard for a moment. "Goodbye, Richard." The doors closed with a heavy thud, leaving Richard alone in the silent courtroom, with nothing but a plastic pen and a life that had evaporated into thin air. But as he stood there, numb, the side door of the courtroom opened. "Mr. Sterling?" a voice asked. Richard turned, hoping it was Bradley coming back, or perhaps a clerk with some paperwork he had missed. 2 men in dark suits entered. They weren't lawyers. They wore windbreakers with yellow letters on the back. FBI. "Richard Sterling?" the lead agent asked, flashing a badge. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding wire fraud and insider trading. Please place your hands behind your back." Richard laughed. It was a high, hysterical sound. "Of course," he said, holding out his wrists. Of course he didn't just call the SEC. As the handcuffs clicked tight, cold steel against his skin, Richard realized the true depth of the twist. He hadn't just lost the divorce, he had celebrated taking everything, only to realize he had been holding a grenade the entire time. And Catherine, sweet, simple Catherine, had finally pulled the pin. 1 year later, the view from Richard Sterling's window was very different. There were no skylines of Manhattan, no Central Park foliage, and certainly no champagne. There was only a chain-link fence, a yard of grey concrete, and the bleak, rolling hills of upstate New York surrounding the Otisville Correctional Facility. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. In his old life, Richard would have been finishing a power lunch at Le Bernardin, perhaps bullying a supplier into lowering their rates. In this life, it was recreational hour. Richard sat on a plastic chair in the common room, staring at the mounted television encased in protective plexiglass. Most of the inmates were watching a soccer match, but Richard had bartered 2 packs of cigarettes to switch the channel to CNBC. He told them he wanted to check his stocks. The other inmates laughed at him. They knew who he was. They knew he didn't have any stocks left. On the screen, the headline flashed in bold red letters. Blackwood Logistics posts record profits. The camera cut to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. A woman stood on the balcony, ready to ring the closing bell. She looked radiant. She wore a suit of emerald green, a color that signaled life and growth. Her hair was loose, framing a face that was no longer hidden behind the mask of a dutiful, silent wife. It was Catherine. Beside her stood Silas Thorne, looking frail but proud, leaning heavily on his hawk-head cane. Richard watched, mesmerized and sickened, as the reporter spoke. It has been a remarkable turnaround for the logistics giant, formerly known as Sterling Dynamics. Since ousting its disgraced CEO Richard Sterling amidst federal fraud charges last year, the company has rebranded under the leadership of Catherine Blackwood Thorne. By liquidating the phantom assets created by her ex-husband and focusing on sustainable, ethical shipping, the company has not only recovered, but thrived. The reporter turned to Catherine for a comment. Ms. Blackwood, many critics said a former florist couldn't run a Fortune 500 company. What do you say to them? On the grainy prison TV, Catherine smiled. It was the same genuine, warm smile Richard had fallen in love with 12 years ago, before his greed suffocated it. I'd say that business is a lot like gardening, Catherine said, her voice clear and confident. You have to nurture what's real, be patient with the roots, and most importantly, you have to pull the weeds before they choke the whole garden. The room around Richard erupted in laughter. "Hey, Richie!" one of the inmates shouted, tossing a crumpled paper cup at him. "She called you a weed, man." Richard didn't react. He couldn't. He stared at the screen as Catherine rang the bell, the sound echoing like a death knell for his ego. The applause on the television was deafening. She was loved. She was respected. She was powerful, and she had done it all without him. The guard blew his whistle. "Rec time is over. Back to your cells." Richard stood up slowly. His joints ached. He worked in the prison laundry now, folding sheets for 12 cents an hour. It was ironic, he thought bitterly. He used to complain that Catherine didn't do enough housework. Now, housework was his entire existence. As he shuffled back toward his cell, head bowed, he thought about the prenup. He thought about the champagne cork hitting the ceiling at the Ritz. He thought about the moment he told his friends he was going to take everything. He had been right, in a way. He had taken everything. He had taken all the greed, all the lies, and all the arrogance, and he had locked them away in a 6x8 cell. He sat on his cot and looked at the small metal shelf drilled into the wall. There was no Macallan 25. There were no cigars. There was only a single, faded photograph he had managed to keep. It wasn't of Tiffany, the model who had abandoned him the second the handcuffs went on. It was a picture of Catherine, taken on their honeymoon, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked by the side of the road. She looked happy in the photo. She looked at him like he was the center of the universe. Richard Sterling, the man who thought he was the smartest person in the room, finally closed his eyes and let the tears come. He had traded a diamond for a pocketful of stones. He had celebrated his victory before the game was over, and now, in the silence of his cage, he finally understood the cost. He had won the divorce, but he had lost his life, and that is the story of Richard Sterling, a man who learned too late that the most dangerous person in the room isn't always the one shouting the loudest. Sometimes it's the one quietly arranging the flowers. It's a powerful reminder that arrogance is a blindfold, and kindness is not a weakness. Richard thought he could discard people like objects, never realizing that the foundation he stood on was built by the very people he was trying to crush. In the end, the simple florist knew how to grow an empire, while the brilliant businessman only knew how to dig his own grave. So what do you think? Did Richard deserve the harsh punishment he got? Or was Silas Thorne too cruel for setting a trap that lasted 10 years? I'd love to hear your opinion. Was this justice served, or revenge taken too far? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes drama and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.